Both of his scholarship and his performance practice focuses on connections and collaborations between artists, academics, art administrators, and activists. Brandon's monograph, which has been really influential already for our research group and our kind of thinking around theater and gentrification, is called Institutional Theatrics, Performing Arts Policy in Post-War Berlin. It was published by Northwestern University Press in 2021, and it shows how theater and performance can help us rethink public institutions in the arts. Focusing on recent restructurings of a number of Berlin's major theaters, he argues that cultural policy can be thought of as an artistic practice of infrastructural imagining and not just an administrative agenda for delegating funds. Moreover, understanding performance itself as a form of cultural policy can help us rethink the ways artists lean on and into systems of state support as the very means of their doing and sometimes undoing. He's also recently co-edited Post-Dramatic Theatre and Form with Matt Cornish and Shane Boyle, which intervenes in an ongoing debate about contemporary experimental performance by developing a theory around theatrical form. Concurrent with his scholarship, Brandon's artistic work explores theater's capacity for social practice or as a social practice. Over the last decade, he's co-founded and co-directed 3 performance ensembles, the Culinary Theater, Shakespeare in the Park Berlin, and the UC Movement for Efficient Privatization. I'm assuming UC is University of California in this instant?
UCMEP is the acronym.
Oh, yep. These groups have been featured in various research publications and academic journals, as well as journalistic outlets such as the New York Times, the Guardian, and the Berliner Tageszeitung. Brandon, I'm really, really happy that you can join us today. The floor is yours.
Wow. Thank you so much to everyone for being here and for the kind introduction. And yeah, and really looking forward to the conversation afterwards. So let me just figure out, I'm a little Zoom rusty, just to share the screen. Yeah, does that work? And can everyone hear me? Somebody just give me a thumbs up.
Yes, that works.
Yeah. Great. Okay, so my hope is to talk for about 35 minutes or so, and then, hopefully we can have a sort of nice, robust, free-form conversation afterwards. Okay, so here we go. The Berlin theater landscape is in crisis yet again. For much of 2024, Berlin Senator for Culture Joe Cialo warned that looming austerity reductions to the capital city's budget would surely impact the cultural sector. And on November 19th, 2024, which Berlin's finance senator Stefan Evers from the CDU-Partei called a day for truth and clarity, the Senate announced a €3 billion cut to take immediate effect on January 1st, 2025, in just 42 days from that announcement, impacting a broad range of public services and projects. Accompanying this announcement, a list of cuts to individual cultural institutions was leaked to the press, taking the entire theater and performance community by surprise. For example, the budget for the Schaubühne would be reduced by 1.8 million euros, the Deutsches Theater by 3 million, the Volksbühne am Rosa-Luxemburg-Platz by 2 million, the Gorki Theater by 1 million, and the Berliner Ensemble by 1.75 million euros. Berlin's sprawling independent or freie Szene would be hit even harder, with dramatic cuts to its diverse array of rehearsal and project spaces, funding instruments, and presenting houses like the Hebel am Ufer, the Hau Complex, and the Sophienseele. How and why decisions were made about the demise or salvation of individual institutions and organizations remained a mystery. Cuts were negotiated in backroom meetings of the coalition government's political parties, bypassing institutional leadership and thereby leaving those directly affected by this so-called lawnmower effect, this sort of cutting little bits from lots of individual houses, no time to react. The total cuts amounted to 136 million euros, or 12% of the current cultural budget, though the pause, and some say maybe the stop in renovation work on the Komische Oper of 10 million euros, and the lack of compensation or planning for cost of living salary increases of 17 million euros brought the cuts to about 20% of the current cultural budget. Disgruntled artists, politicians, and institutional leaders from across Berlin's cultural panorama launched an extended protest campaign against the political machinations of the ruling parties and staunch critiques of Joe Cialo's failed leadership as culture senator, with coordinated articles, a pretty sort of standard array of cultural political critique. Coordinated articles, press appearances, social media blasts, petitions, rallies and demonstrations, public conversations and sit-ins, etc. According to Claudia Schmitz, the managing director of the German Theater Association, no theater could, quote, save the required amounts within so few months. The vast majority of a theater's budget is tied up in personnel and infrastructure, and the core artistic programming budget is also firmly planned through binding contracts with artists well into 2027, many of which are already paid out. Sascha Waltz and her company proclaim that the entire Berlin dance scene lies on the brink of collapse, and Thomas Ostermeier, who calculated that the Schaubühne would have to file for bankruptcy at the end of 2025, issued this statement. Hang on, let me just see if I can get Ostermeier there. Can everybody see that? Yeah, okay. So I'm going to read the statement. There's nothing more to be saved on fixed costs. We're already under great economic pressure. Electricity prices are rising, rents and water prices are rising, material costs for stage sets are rising, tariffs are rising. There's often talk of the, quote, large bloated apparatus. We'll come back to that later. But take a walk through the building with me. I can explain to you for each and every person in the building why we need them and why we still have too few personnel resources. I expect cultural policy to fight for culture in the interests of the city. Culture and science are the areas for which Berlin is famous all over the world, and explicitly all areas of culture, including counterculture, Clubkultur, club culture, the independent or freie Szene, the music scene, the gallery scene. All of this makes Berlin what it is. A governing mayor should really say, we're strengthening culture, otherwise this city will become barren and empty. Then, between gentrification and precarity, there would no longer be any islands where people can think about what it means to be human. Shaving that off now will destroy something that is irretrievable. Ostermeier's comments make clear that these austerity cuts and the debates they sparked extend beyond any singular theater's budget or proscenium and call into question the priorities of Berlin's cultural policy and even the future of the city. So just a few orienting questions that seem to come up from these debates. Should the German-speaking world remain committed to maintaining its unique, albeit highly costly theater system, grounded historically on large ensembles, extensive repertoires, and state support? Or has the time come for the theater to justify its activities more economically and compete in an innovation-based global network of private and third sector-driven creative industries? Now, when asked about this in interviews, Cialo, who's now being considered by incoming Chancellor Friedrich Merz as the federal minister for culture, as Cialo likes to point to the shining example of Berlin's techno scene. Club culture, he says, shows how economic thinking, personal initiative, and self-financing can help you survive in difficult times. This is still Cialo. Things cannot continue as they have been up until now. Cialo's boss, Mayor Kai Wegner, follows suit. This is a recent quote. Is it right, he asked recently, that the supermarket saleswoman, who probably rarely goes to the state opera, is co-financing this ticket with her tax money? So if we can look past this potentially sexist, classist, racist, and even populist implications of this kind of statement for a moment, it seems that gentrification and precarity are just what Cialo and Wegner have in mind, and both have confirmed that more, perhaps double the amount of austerity cuts are coming down the pike in 26 and 2027. This is Cialo again, quote, we must now tighten our austerity muscles and come to terms with the fact that there is less money available for the future of culture. It's time for more personal responsibility and a concrete discussion of the question, how can we act economically in order to be future-proof? Now, for those of us based in the US or other contexts whose jaws might drop at the thought of a robust system of centralized funding for the arts and an 800 million euro culture budget, The demand that theater institutions justify their bottom lines, navigate fickle markets and popular demands, and secure always limited funding from any source possible is rather standard. Here in New York, where I'm based, it's how the theater functions, and as my students like to say, how the industry functions. But in Germany, this particular brand of institutional disavowal, so eager to rethink big government and its law, or those broad, what did Ostermeyer say? These bloated institutions and its long-standing swath of accompanying infrastructures of support in the arts sector for a more flexible model of personal initiative. This is still highly controversial in many camps. Indeed, in Germany, cultural policy or Kulturpolitik and the often tenuous relationships between state and market, between modes of social organization and artistic production that it encompasses, is still very much up for debate. Indeed, and this is to refunction Ostermeyer's language, what kind of island is the theater, and what does it mean to fight for culture? Now, despite the great fervor of the most recent funding crises and the penchant for institutional leaders to emphasize the unprecedented dimensions of these new austerity cuts, public debate about the state of the state-subsidized stage, indeed about the relationship between the state and the state stage, has a long institutional history in Berlin. I begin with this most recent hubbub also to emphasize that many of the questions that constitute the most recent contemporary cultural policy discourse first came into high relief after the fall of the Berlin Wall 35 years ago, as Berlin was thrust itself into a new era. The ensuing years, back in the 90s, of what many have since labeled the first Berlin theater crisis, saw a series of dramatic shifts. The dismantling of a number of long-standing theater institutions, the refunctioning of older institutions with new purposes and financial or economic orientations, and the so-called retreat from institutions writ large toward freer and more independent scenes. So I just want to talk a little bit, and if this is repeat for any of you, I'm just going to talk a little bit about my book from 2021 that Cleo mentioned. In 21, I published this book called Institutional Theatrics, and the central project of the book was to explore how various artistic strategies can be employed to critically engage and perhaps even undo entrenched institutional habits, infrastructural frameworks, and organizing principles, and to think about how contemporary performance might also do the urgent work of what we might call cultural policy. So just a few sort of key questions that animate the book. What does it mean to perform policy? How might we bring policy studies into, or at least more in line with, performance studies? And how does an examination of the intersections of performance and policy provide a heuristic to better understand theater's changing role in a changing society, to better understand the shifting relations between stage and state? Now, the book takes up these questions specifically in the context, as Cleo mentioned, of post-war Berlin, as the new German capital redefined itself as a kind of global arts epicenter amidst a steady proliferation over the subsequent 35 years of governmental agendas to dismantle Germany's long-standing tradition of state-subsidized art. To tell this history, I look at the restructuring of some of Berlin's most central performance venues since the 1990s, like the Schillertheater, the Berliner Ensemble, the Volksbühne, and the Hebel am Ufer, as well as the emergence of a set of prominent makers and ensembles in the context of both the state stages as well as in the Freie Szene. What I tried to argue in the book is that these varied stages of neoliberal disavowal in the long wake of reunification also provoked a range of experimental performance practices, both on and off stage. Sorry for the honking. There's construction going on my street, so apologies for that. Hope it's not too loud. Okay, so where was I? Okay, so what I tried to argue is that these varied stages of neoliberal disavowal in the process of German reunification provoked a range of performative practices on and off stage that worked to forge new kinds of relations between performance and the institutions that house and support it. The different projects I track throughout the book assume really diverse and different forms, but I found myself utterly fascinated over and over again by, especially for an American, this seemingly paradoxical scenario where theater artists who receive public support make use of that support, both to avow the administrations that govern from above, while also working to transform them from within. So this is the fuck off on the face of the Volksbühne. What is, how is this in many ways this sort of double position of a state subsidized institution talking to its public and to its supporters? In other words, these various projects share a commitment to what I called in the book performative arts of institutional disavowal. For instance, and just two sort of quick examples, in the first half of the book, which focuses on the changing structures of the state stages after reunification, I spend time exploring how Frank Kastorf and his company, then known as his Company of Misfits, now infamously instituted an aesthetic as well as an administrative philosophy based on chaos at the Volksbühne in the early 1990s. In those years after the wall fell, and as many of you who've done any reading about Berlin likely know, the Volksbühne was at its best, so thought the leadership at least, when left-wing and right-wing radicals came to blows during marathon post-dramatic performances. The institution was doing its job when the arguments in the cantina, the bar downstairs, were just as interesting as the works on the stage. The Volksbühne was most successful when it featured a chaotic jumble of theatrical forms supplemented by a robust dramaturgical program, though it was sometimes hard to piece together exactly what the logic of the dramaturgy was, a program of concerts, symposia, films, lectures, and political meetings that filled all rooms of the massive building until very, very late at night. So for Kastorf and the company, this chaos amidst all its problems, and there were many problems, was a deeply politicized and dutiful practice of critique in order to rethink, reorganize, and restructure the state theater apparatus from the inside. Or in the second half of the book, and I think some of you focused specifically on this, those of you who were involved in the ERC group, the second half of the book moves from the state stages to focus on this free scene, the freie Szene, the independent scene, where I explore how a group of interdisciplinary theater artists set out to question the best type of arts institution for the newly gentrifying center of reunified Berlin in the early 2000s. Within the architectural frame of the Palast der Republik, which was destined for destruction, that was the sort of former center of East Berlin, which was destined for destruction to make room for the erection of the ever controversial Humboldt Forum, through this reconstruction of the Stadtschloss, the sort of old monarchical palace, or at least the facades of the palace. These artists from the burgeoning free scene invaded the building and erected a new form of temporary performance institution. By flooding, they actually flooded the entire Palast and erecting a kind of performative water park. I argued in the book that the initiators erected a space of collective memory for a disparate German citizenry and foregrounded the Palast and its history as an indispensable part of cultural life in the new Berlin and the newly gentrifying Berlin. A very different model of infrastructural remembering than what the Humboldt Forum, with its sort of reconstruction of these old facades, would eventually institutionalize at the Schlossplatz on the Unter den Linden. So my hope for the book was that the various forms of institutional imagination I look at in post-war Berlin might have implications beyond their historical moment and give us new ways to think about politics at the theater. What might it mean to make theater politically, in addition to focusing on making, quote, political theater? Throughout the book, I try to suggest that aesthetic formations can't be neatly separated from institutional and broader social formations, and that formal experimentation can provide us with both a conceptual and also a practical means for rethinking our institutions of public life. So as I was preparing for this talk, I rediscovered a public policy document I hadn't read in quite some time, since I was first started writing the book. In the spring of 1991, the then newly appointed cultural senator Ulrich Roloff Momin commissioned theater critic Ivan Nagel, and sort of general theater public intellectual at the time. Nagel was a sort of big, major public figure, and three other critic colleagues, Michael Merschmeyer, Henning Riechbieter, and Friedrich Diekmann, to pen a series of so-called Considerations on the Future of the Berlin Theater, which is where the title of the talk also came from. So to sort of pen these expert considerations in the wake of reunification. And there are two citations that appear toward the start of that now infamous document, which Naga published in two different memoir sort of collections before his death. There are two citations that appear toward the start of that document, which I wanted to share with you as a kind of anchor for the rest of the remarks. And they're a little bit long, so I'm going to pull them up here. Hopefully you can see the text, and I'm going to just sort of put them into our space together, okay? Our task is not, with a bad conscience, to discover emergency solutions. We won't offer a recipe for how to save the remnants of Berlin's theater life with remnants of finance. Instead, we offer a kind of draft plan for the Berlin theater at the start of the decade. Here's the first part that's most pressing to decide, namely state and private theater. A renowned and essential but long-torn domain of German culture wants to become a new whole. How should this whole look? What structures and resources does it need? And here's the second citation from the beginning of that document. With the unification of Berlin, the preservation, no, the increase of the city's cultural diversity is essential. The politicization of culture from 1949 to 1989 attempted on both sides of the wall to impose the same representative mission on theaters of different traditions and styles. Today's cultural policy should motivate them to develop their individuality. The goal then cannot be the fearful and thoughtless preservation of everything that exists now. Moreover, it cannot be the sacrifice of half of the historical grown inventory. The goal must only be the profiling of each individual institution, the diversity of a metropolis. That requires trying out different forms of theater production and theater funding. Now, while these so-called expert considerations expressly issued a plea for the preservation of Berlin's diverse theater landscape, they also generated a great deal of public pushback for their earnest and detailed appraisals of every individual performance institution and their often controversial proposals, which the authors claimed required courage and willingness to try out different forms of theater production and subsidy. And if anyone has ever sort of heard this, how Kustoff and his team from sort of the Far East came, ended up taking over the Volksbühne for 25 years. It came from this document where they said, well, let's put this young East ensemble in, and in 3 years they'll either be famous or the theater will be dead. And then it doesn't matter, because if it's dead, we'll save the money that we would invest in it anyway. So that's sort of the what's most known about this document. Okay. So they want to try out different forms of theater production and subsidy. The authors also seem dead set against the lawnmower approach of smaller cuts across the board. In rereading the document, I was taken by these citations, as they also seem to provide a glimpse, even if it's an oblique glimpse, into a Berlin already caught uncomfortably between a robust history of welfare state theater on the one hand, and the emergence of an alternative ethos, or some might call it a new spirit, of self-administering and project-based creativity on the other. Starts to sound a lot about like the kinds of things Cialo is advocating for just in the last few months. So I just want to give a little bit more context on the so-called historically grown inventory. The authors of the document found themselves tasked with profiling and issuing expert considerations on what to do. Throughout the Cold War, on both sides of the wall, legislators, arts administrators, and artists across both Germanys maintained dogged commitments to national traditions of public support for the arts. Theater subsidies in the former Western Federal Republic were higher per capita than any other country in the world. And centralized support for the theater in the formerly Eastern German Democratic Republic, or the DDR, was also quite substantial. Accordingly, the reunification treaty signed in August of 1990 made an explicit commitment to maintaining the continuity of cultural life in the newly reunified nation, including deep support, ongoing support, state support for the theater. This commitment proved harder than expected to maintain, however. According to the West German Constitution, amended to include East Germany in 1990, the individual German states were responsible for subsidizing art and culture. In line with the agreement to fold the former DDR into the West German system, the responsibilities of all formerly East German cultural institutions passed from the central government to the newly formed state governments. And reunification proved incredibly expensive. especially in the former East, which faced enormous deficits and major unemployment in the years after reunification. Anticipating the potential lack of funds to support the expanded cultural sphere, the new federal government committed to a temporary sum of transitional and explicitly federal subsidies. But this federal commitment ultimately proved inadequate to ameliorate the rising deficits and infrastructural uncertainty that ensued, and some suggest that this ongoing infrastructural uncertainty in the former East has fed the dramatic rise of the alt-right AfD, or Alternative for Deutschland, in recent years. If anyone saw the recent map from the Germans' elections, it's pretty scary when you look at the former East. Now, due to its unique status as city, state, and future capital of the new German nation, Berlin became the focus of much cultural political attention. Though Berlin received some additional funding from the temporary federal fund due to its exceptional status, the newly reunified city found itself responsible almost overnight for an unprecedented number of cultural institutions from the East and the West. Cultural Senator Rolf Momin continually emphasized that Berlin's cultural offerings were the richest of all European metropolises. And it's true, the numbers were staggering: 39 theaters, 21 of which received almost complete state subsidies, 7 orchestras, 3 operas, 167 museums, 400 art galleries, and on and on. What Rolf Momin never explicitly discussed, however, were the structural and political preconditions, in other words, the fiscal woes, that led the authors of the considerations documents, Nagel and his team, to query how to make do with, quote, remnants of finance, and just what alternative forms might undergird this new whole. In fact, the new Berlin government's priorities did not at all neatly align with the, quote, renowned and essential values of fully state-supported theater at all. Why? Because the city was in major amounts of debt. In former West Berlin, decision makers had to face the gradual phasing out of federal subsidies, which led ultimately to a 30% net reduction in the city's overall budget between 1993 and 1994. So that's saying so much for unprecedented cuts. In the former eastern end of town, the sudden integration of the failed state socialist system into a relatively market-oriented one proved incredibly expensive and resulted in both increased unemployment and a steadily declining GDP, as well as increased welfare expenditures. The merger also led to the doubling of many of the city's public institutions, and this is what Nagel and his team are alluding to, including, of course, operas and theaters. So you had this sort of doubling effect. Berlin's first unified elections in December 1990 also marked a definitive shift in the city's program of urban governance. On December 2nd, the center-right Christian Democrats, the CDU, won the election with 40% of the vote, and the centrist Social Democrats, the SPD, were close behind with 30%. The two winning parties formed quickly a so-called Grand Coalition under the leadership of Mayor Eberhard Diepken, which would govern Berlin for the next decade. The political priorities that united the Grand Coalition were clear and explicit: to respond to all the above-mentioned challenges of reunification by transforming Berlin into a European, or even better, a globally competitive cosmopolitan post-Fordist metropolis. And they often use that language. This shift toward an explicitly entrepreneurial or emerging neoliberal agenda was immediately evident in the Wild West economic policies and accompanying real estate building boom actively promoted by the Grand Coalition from its very first days in office. An intricate system of new laws, direct subsidies, and tax incentives to benefit developers and real estate companies was quickly put into place to stimulate rapid urban development. This incentive, combined with the new city government's belief that office buildings were a sign of economic promise, fueled the construction of an enormous supply of retail and office space in the former East. Within just a few years, a slew of multinational corporations and other investors were lured to Potsdamer Platz, Alexanderplatz, and Friedrichstraße, and other former Eastern development sites. And if you go today, you see that it's just these enormous sort of malls. Ultimately, however, the new supply proved too great. Nearly 7 million square meters of office space were built in Berlin between 1990 and 1998, and much of it remained unoccupied, contributing to a real estate market crisis later in the decade, as well as more debt, which would reach 40 billion euros by 2001 and 55 billion euros by 2004, which is, of course, what led the mayor to say, well, we're arm aber sexy, we're poor but sexy, right? Berlin was in monster amounts of debt. A significant portion of this debt was the direct consequence of corruption orchestrated by members of the Grand Coalition government throughout the course of its tenure. This worst practice urban governance came into highest relief with the exposure of the Berlin banking scandal in 2001. It turned out that throughout the 1990s, the city government itself participated in a number of large-scale speculative real estate investments through a public-private financial corporation called the Bankgesellschaft Berlin. In 2001, it was announced that these investments had gone belly up and that the bank was in need of a substantial capital infusion because of major losses from a series of failed investments. And to make matters worse, it also came to light that politicians from the CDU had played a substantial role in the more than questionable management and creative accounting of the bank. And then to add insult to already sustained injury, the city government voted not to close the failing Bankgesellschaft, but instead to approve a 35 billion euro risk shield law, which transferred the financial risk of the bank's outstanding speculative investments onto the city and its taxpayers. So in spite of the intended shield, the overall financial losses from the banking scandal amounted to somewhere between 20 and 30 billion euros and ultimately fueled the collapse of the Grand Coalition later in 2001. Now, in the face of this history yet to come, it's interesting to return to the considerations document from 1991. Although the authors insisted that the most important task of Berlin cultural policy was to consolidate and preserve the city's rich cultural traditions, it soon became clear that the newly elected government had a different financial structure in mind for the massive network of state stages, namely one featuring much less state involvement. In the immediate context of reunification, authorities working on behalf of the Grand Coalition launch a sustained critique of the state-subsidized stage's infrastructural stagnation. This political attack resulted ultimately in the unexpected and highly controversial closure of the Staatliche Schauspielbühnen in 1993. The three-stage, that means like states, I call it the state stage complex, the state stages for Schauspiel. Okay, the three-stage Staatliche Schauspielbühnen was the largest theater complex in all of Germany. Grand Coalition politicians justified the closure with arguments that the bloat, which Ostermeyer continues to mention, arguments that bloat supported enduring intransigent inflexibility, bureaucratic malaise, and an abuse of privilege through rapidly expanding administrative and technical apparatuses and outdated federal and municipal budgetary laws. Not to mention, this was the other critique, totally mediocre theater. That's what the politicians came and started saying about the Schiller Theater. In the interest of so-called creativity, then, austerity was deemed necessary to relieve the city of its high cultural expenditures by transitioning toward private initiatives more closely attuned to the benefits of a consumer-oriented theater model and a commercially driven box office. As early as 1991, Mayor Diepgen touted the importance of a commercial theater that catered exclusively to its audience. His prime exemplar was producer and entrepreneur Friedrich Kurz, who founded the Neue Flora Theater in Hamburg and became famous throughout Germany for his successful transatlantic transfers of Andrew Lloyd Webber musicals. Diepgen praised Kurz. Sorry, the cops are cruising by. Just one second. Don't want to scream over the sirens.
Brendan, we can't hear any of the sirens.
You can't hear the sirens at all?
It's
Oh my goodness. Wow, it's super loud. Okay, so he got really famous for all these Andrew Lloyd Webber musicals in Germany. And Diepgen, the mayor, praised Kurz's desire to transform the old Winter Garden Varieté Theater on formerly Eastern Friedrichstraße into a hotel, restaurant, entertainment complex. So to supporters of the state stage, including the authors of the consideration document, including Naga and his team, Diepgen's penchant for the boulevardization, or as they called it, the Americanization of German theater was by no means uncontroversial. They worried that the so-called success of businessmen and producers like Kurz would serve as an alibi for Berlin's cultural policy to reduce both its responsibilities and its spending. This criticism of the new government's efforts to relieve the city of its admittedly high cultural expenditures via private initiatives was a common and rather foreseeable position in response to the Grand Coalition's emerging priorities in the 1990s. What could have not been foreseen, though, was the extreme dearth of good sense that the city government would exhibit in its use and often abuse of these more flexible business models, like the GmbH, which is in English, the translation is the limited liability company. While I don't have time to go into detail on that, these inherent dangers came to light, for instance, in the €100 million scandal that emerged around the bid to hold the 2000 Olympics in Berlin. And in the context of both the Berliner Ensemble and the Schaubühne, which were refunctioned as GmbHs, as these limited liability companies in the 1990s, their organizational structure was much more vulnerable to shifts in the federal funding landscape. So Oliver Reza, who's the intendant, the artistic director of the Berliner Ensemble today, commented and recently to the most recent cuts and said this. He says before this that the Berliner Ensemble is still a GmbH. I am the personally liable partner. So in case of doubt, we don't have the state of Berlin behind us, which could allow us to incur debt in view of the austerity measures, but we're threatened with insolvency after a foreseeable period of time, I reckon about 2 years. So Ostermeyer and Reza are really worried that both the Schaubühne and the Berliner Ensemble could go bankrupt, before 2027. So what I've tried to do today is tease out just a few ways the urgent structural conversations that emerged about Berlin theater in the early 1990s might also serve as a lens for understanding the shifting social realities after the wall came down and even today. This is also the broader methodological project of institutional theatrics of my book as a whole. Indeed, the book's chapters work to historicize the very conditions of possibility for Berlin's most recent theater crisis by tracking an extended set of performance-based responses to what I think, or what I see, or what I try to argue is a persistent set of policy questions over 35 years. In a city struggling to determine just how neoliberal it can afford to be, what kinds of performing arts practices and institutions are necessary, and why. Okay, so we're coming to the end. I just want to return briefly to the considerations document with this line that's highlighted here in yellow. Okay. The preservation, no, the increase of the city's cultural diversity is essential. In the wake of the Trump administration's and other far right-wing governments' most recent assaults on diversity, even made it's hard to even talk about theater in the wake of what's happening at Columbia today, but also at my own institution. I found myself reading this sentence in the Naga report, the considerations document, over and over. Of course, in 1991, the authors were concerned about maintaining the diversity of former Eastern voices as they watched the rapid absorption of DDR life and culture into the more powerful West. But in the aftermath of René Pollisch's untimely death in February last year, the question of who should take over leadership of Germany's perhaps most important and most heavily politicized state stage, the Volksbühne, seemed to dominate the pages of every feuilleton across Germany yet again, sort of ongoing for the last months. So I read the debate with excitement and anticipation, but was perhaps most provoked by Austrian performance artist Florentina Holzinger's comment to Ulrich Seidler of the Berliner Zeitung last May when asked if she'd consider taking the helm at the Volksbühne. And she wrote, well, this was in an in-person interview. She says, someone will have to do it. People are always so worried. I think the job should be done by someone who, like me, isn't worried about the future of the theater. So I read this a few times and I was really wondering, is Holzinger merely being glib here? One of the central challenges I faced in the writing of institutional theatrics, and one of the striking features of Berlin's post-wall theatrical establishment, is that a significant portion of the performance landscape in the 90s and 2000s was dominated predominantly by white and most often male artists, thinkers, and politicians. So if the so-called future of the theater, as Holzinger puts it, is inextricably bound up, however indirectly, with a monolithic past, so obscenely dominated by one particular subject position, the white dude, perhaps Holzinger's lack of worry or her not caring is her indirect attempt to frame the future in a different light, with a different set of guiding questions. How might radical, feminist, queer, and anti-racist reorientations and reorganizations serve as long overdue mandates for both institutional as well as aesthetic transformation in Berlin and beyond? In other words, what might anti-racist and anti-sexist institutionality look like in the German theater? And what new aesthetic forms might these necessarily new organizational forms enable in addition to more robust representation for historically marginalized subjects? Now, whether the Volksbühne is still the stage on which policy will be performed differently in the coming months and years, I don't know. Just last month, another mid-60s white guy, Matthias Lilienthal, was picked to take the lead at the Volksbühne, with Holzinger in an as yet unclear supporting advisory role. It's not exactly clear what that means. And we've been chatting because I'm teaching a course on her work now, but she hasn't really been particularly forthcoming about what that's going to look like. The recent austerity cuts have also slashed funding for Impact-Förderung and diversity arts culture, Berlin's two largest initiatives committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion in the culture sector, especially in the Freie Szene. And yet, as the inevitable project of institutional reimagining unfolds in the face of the most recent theater crisis and the violent delegating of funds proceeds, I look forward to seeing the ways artists like Holzinger stage imminent critiques of that monolithic past, and in so doing, fight for culture by reimagining the future intersections of performance and policy and of stage and state in new lights and new constellations. Thanks so much.